Alright. I'm just gonna read the rest of this. Okay, on page 706. I think there's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Yeah, there's exactly 10 pages left. A couple of them don't really have that much on it, so that's cool, but a lot of them do. Oh well. Oh god, these pages are gonna be awful. Ugh, modernism. Okay. 706. Humans develop wings. Gasoline engines also provide the power that enabled humans to fill the age-old dream of sprouting wings. After near successful experiments by others in the heavier-than aircraft, the Wright brothers, Orville and Wilbur, performed the miracle at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. On a historic day, December 17, 1903, Orville Wright took aloft a feeble engine plane that stayed airborne for 12 seconds and 120 feet. Thus, the air age was launched by two obscure Ohio bicycle repairmen. As aviation gradually got off the ground, the world slowly shrank. The public was made increasingly air-minded by unsung heroes, often martyrs, who appeared as stunt flyers at fairs and other public gatherings. Airplanes, flying coffins, were used with great marked success for various purposes during the Great War of 1914 to 18. Shortly thereafter, private companies began to operate passenger lines with airmail contracts, which were in effect a subsidy from Washington. The first transcontinental airmail route was established from New York to San Francisco in 1920. In 1927, modest and skillful cat Charles A. Lindbergh, the so-called Flying Fool, electrified the world with the first solo west-to-east conquest of the Atlantic. Seeking a prize of $27,000, the lanky stunt flyer courageously piloted his single-engine plane, the Spirit of St. Louis, from New York to Paris in a grueling 33 hours and 39 minutes. Lindbergh's exploit swept Americans off their feet. Fed up with the cynicism and debunking of the jazz age, they found in this wholesome and handsome youth a genuine hero. They clasped the soaring lone eagle to their hearts much more warmly than the bashful young man desired. Lucky Lindy received an uproarious welcome in the Hero Canyon of Lower Broadway, as 1,800 tons of ticker tape and other improvised confetti showered upon him. Lindbergh's achievement, it was more than a stunt, did much to dramatize and popularize flying, while giving a strong boost to the infant aviation industry. The impact of the airship was tremendous. It provided the restless American spirit with another dimension. At the same time, it gave birth to a giant new industry. Unfortunately, the accident rate in the pioneer stages of aviation was high, though hardly more so than on the early railroads. But by the 1930s and 40s, travel by air on regularly scheduled airlines was significantly safer than on many overcrowded highways. Humanity's new wings also increased the tempo of an already breathless civilization. The floundering railroad received another setback through the loss of passengers and mail. A lethal new weapon was given to the gods of war, and with the coming of the city-busting aerial bombs, people could well debate whether the conquest of the air was a blessing or a curse. The Atlantic Ocean was shriveling to about the size of the agency of the days of Socrates, while isolation behind ocean moats was becoming a bygone dream. The radio revolution. The speed of the airplane was far eclipsed by the speed of radio waves. Marconi, an Italian, invented wireless telegraphy in the 1890s, and his brainchild was used for long-range communication during World War I. Next came the voice-carrying radio, a triumph of many minds. A red letter day was posted in November 1920 when the Pittsburgh radio station KDKA broadcast the news. Okay, try this again. A red letter day was posted in November 1920 when the Pittsburgh radio station KDKA broadcast the news of the Harding landslide. Later miracles were achieved in the transatlantic wireless phonographs, radio telephones, and television. The earliest radio programs reached only local audiences, but by the late 1920s, technological improvements made long-distance broadcasting possible, and national commercial networks drowned out much of the local programming. Meanwhile, advertising commercials made radio another vehicle for American free enterprises, contrasted with the government-owned systems of Europe. While other just bit my tongue. Ow! While other marvels of the area, like the automobile, were luring Americans away from home, the radio was drawing them back. For much of the decade, family and neighbors gathered around a household sole radio as they once had around the toasty earth. Radio knitted the nation together. Various regions heard voices with standardized accents, and countless millions tuned in to perennial comedy favorites like Amos and Andy. Programs sponsored by the manufacturers and distributors of brand-name products like the A&P Gypsies and Everyday Hour Eveready Hour helped to make radio touted to labels household words and purchases. I can't read. Educationally and culturally, the radio made a significant contribution. Sports were further stimulated. Politicians had to adjust their speaking techniques to a new medium, and millions rather than thousands of voters heard their promises and pleas. A host of listeners followed the gospel of their favorite newscaster, or were even ringside participants in world-shaking events. Finally, the music of famous artists and symphony orchestras was beamed in countless homes. Hollywood film and fantasies. The flickering movie was the fruit of numerous geniuses, including Thomas A. Edison. As early as the 1890s, this novel contraption, though still in crude form, had attained some popularity in the naughty peep show penny arcades. The real birth of the movie came in 1903 when the first story sequence reached the screen. This breathless melodrama, The Great Train Robbery, was featured in the 5-cent theaters popularly called Nickelodeons. Spectacular among the first full-length classics was D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation, which glorified the Ku Klux Klan of Reconstruction days and defamed both black and northern carpetbaggers. White Southerners repeatedly fired guns on the screen during the attempted rape scene. African Americans were outraged at the film and angrily organized protest marches, petition campaigns, and public hearings. A fascinating industry was thus launched. Hollywood in Southern California quickly became the movie capital of the world, for it enjoyed a maximum of sunshine and other advantages. Early producers featured nudity and heavy-lidded female vampires. Vamps and an offended public forced the screen magnates to set up their own rigorous code of censorship. The motion picture really arrived during World War I, when it was used as an engine of anti-German propaganda, especially prepared to hang the Kaiser films aided powerfully in selling war bonds and in boosting morale. A new era began in 1927 with the success of the first talkie, The Jazz Singer, starring the white performer Al Jolson in blackface. The age of the silence was ushered out as theaters everywhere were wired for sound. At about the same time, reasonably satisfactory color films were being produced. Movies eclipsed all other forms of amusement in the phenomenal growth of their popularity. Movie stars of the first pulchritude commanded much larger salaries than the President of the United States, in some cases as much as $100,000 for a single picture. Many actors and actresses were far more widely known than the nation's political leaders. Critics bemoaned the vulgarization of popular taste wrought by new technologies of radio and motion pictures, but the effects of the new mass media were not all negative. The insularity of ethnic communities eroded as the immigrants' children, especially, forsook the neighborhood vaudeville, the theater for the downtown movie place, or turned away from grandma's Yiddish storytelling to tune in Amos and Andy. If some of the rich diversity of the immigrants' old country cultures were lost, the standardization of taste and of language hastened entry into the American mainstream and set the stage for the emergence of working-class political coalition that, for a time, would overcome the divisive ethnic differences of the past. The dynamic decade. Far-reaching changes in lifestyles and values paralleled the dramatic upsurge of the economy. The census of 1920 revealed that for the first time most Americans no longer lived in the countryside but in urban areas. Women continued to find opportunities for employment in the cities, though they tended to cluster in the few low-paying jobs, such as retail clerking and office typing, that became classified as women's work. An organized birth control movement led by the fiery feminist Margaret Sanger openly championed the use of contraceptives. Alice Paul's National Women's Party began in 1923 to campaign for an equal rights amendment to the Constitution. The campaign was still stalled, short of success nearly 9 decades later. To some defenders of traditional ways, it seemed that the world had suddenly gone mad. Even the churches were affected. The fundamentalist champions of the old-time religion lost ground to the modernists, who liked to think that God was a good guy and the universe a pretty chummy place. Some churches tried to fight the devil with worldly weapons. Competing with joyriding automobiles and golf links, they turned to quality entertainment of their own, including wholesome moving pictures for young people. One uptown house of the Lord in New York advertised on a billboard, "Come to church. Christian worship increases your efficiency." Even before the war Okay, let me just take a sip of drink. Even before the war, one observer thought the chimes had struck 6 o'clock in America, and the 1920s witnessed the many old timers regarded as a veritable erratic eruption. Advertisers exploited sexual allure to sell everything from soap to car tires. Once modest maidens now proclaimed that their new freedom is flappers and bob dresses and dresses. Young women appeared in Hemlines elevated, stockings rolled, breasts taped flat, cheeks rouged, and lips a crimson gas that held a dangling cigarette. Thus did the flapper symbolize a yearn for and devil-may-care independence, some said wild abandonment, in some American women. Still more venturesome females shocked their elders when they sported the new one-piece bathing suits. Justification for this newly sexual frankness could be found in the recently translated writings of Dr. Sigmund Freud. The Viennese physician appeared to argue that sexual repression was responsible for a variety of nervous and emotional ills. Thus, not pleasure alone, but also health demanded sexual gratification and liberation. Many taboos flew out the window as sex-conscious Americans let themselves go. As unknowing Freudians, teenagers pioneered the sexual frontiers. Glued together in rhythmic embrace, they danced to jazz music squeaking from phonographs. In an earlier day, a kiss had been the equivalent of a proposal of marriage, but in the new era, exploratory young folks sat in darkened movie houses or took to the highways and byways in automobiles. There, the youthful neckers and petters approached upon the forbidden territory of each other's bodies. If the flapper was the goddess of the era of wonderful nonsense, jazz was its sacred music. With its virtuoso wanderings and tricky syncopation, jazz moved from New Orleans along with the migrating blacks during World War I. Tunes like W.C. Handy's St. Louis Blues became instant classics as the wailing saxophone became the trumpet of the new era. Black performers such as Handy, Jelly Roll Morton, Louis Armstrong, and Joe King Oliver gave birth to jazz, but the entertainment industry soon spawned all-white bands, notably Paul Whiteman's Caucasian impresarios, according to the prophets, though not the creative soul of America's most native music. A new racial pride also blossomed in the northern black communities that burgeoned during and after the war. Harlem in New York City, counting some 150,000 African American residents in the 1920s, was one of the largest black communities in the world. Harlem sustained a vibrant, creative culture that nourished poets like Langston Hughes, whose first volume of the verses, The Weird Blues, appeared in 1926. Harlem in the 1920s also spawned a charismatic political leader, Marcus Garvey. The Jamaican-born Garvey founded the United Negro Improvement Association, UNIA, to promote the resettlement of American blacks in their own African homeland. Within the United States, the UNIA sponsored stores and other businesses like the Black Star Line Steamship Company to keep black dollars in back pockets. Most of Garvey's enterprises failed financially, and Garvey himself was convicted in 1927 for alleged mail fraud and deported by the nervous U.S. government. But the race pride that Garvey inspired among the 4 million blacks who counted themselves UNIA followers at the movement's height helped these newcomers to northern cities gain self-confidence and self-reliance. And his example proved important to the later founding of the Nation of Islam Black Muslim movement. Cultural liberation. Likewise, in literature and the arts, an older era seemed to have ground to a halt with the recent war. By the dawn of the 1920s, most of the custodians of an aging genteel culture had died. Henry James in 1916, Henry Adams in 1918, and William Dean Howells, the Dean of American Literature, in 1920. A few novelists who had been popular in the previous decades continued to thrive, notably the well-to-do cosmopolitan New Yorker Edith Wharton and the Virginia-born Willa Cather, esteemed for her stark but sympathetic portrayals of pioneering on the prairies. Within a decade after the war, a new generation of writers and artists burst upon the scene. Many of them hailed from ethnic and regional backgrounds different from that of the Protestant New Englanders who traditionally had dominated American cultural life. The newcomers exhibited the energy of youth, the ambition of excluded outsiders, and in many cases, the smoldering resentment of ideals betrayed. Animated by the spark of the international modernist movement, they bestowed on American culture a new vitality, imaginativeness, and artistic daring. Central to modernism was its questioning of social conventions and traditional authorities, considered outmoded by the accelerating changes of 20th century life. No one personified this iconoclasm better than H.L. Mencken, the bad boy of Baltimore. As the era's most influential critic, Mencken promoted modernist causes in politics and literature. Little escaped his acidic wit. In his column for the Baltimore Sun, he assailed marriage, patriotism, democracy, prohibition, Rotarians, and other sacred icons of the middle-class American bourgeoisie. The provincial South he contemptuously dismissed as the Sahara of the Beaux-Arts, a bastardization of the Beaux-Arts, French for the fine arts, and he scathingly attacked hypocritical do-gooders as Puritans. Puritanism, he jibed, was the haunting fear that someone somewhere might be happy. The war had jolted many young writers out of their complacency about traditional values and literary standards. With their pens they probed for new codes of morals and understanding, as well as fresh forms of expression. F. Scott Fitzgerald, a handsome Minnesota-born Princetonian, then only 24 years old, became an overnight celebrity when he published This Side of Paradise in 1920. The book became a kind of Bible for the young. It was eagerly devoured by aspiring clappers and their ardent wooers, many of whom affected in the era of bewildered abandon toward life. Catching the spirit of the hour, often about 4 a.m., Fitzgerald found all gods dead, all wars fought, all faiths of man shaken. He followed this melancholy success with The Great Gatsby, 1925, a brilliant commentary on the illusory American ideal of the self-made man. Midwesterner James Gatz reinvented himself as Tycoon Jay Gatsby, only to be destroyed by the power of those with established wealth and social standing. Theodore Dreiser's masterpiece in 1925, An American Tragedy, similarly explored the pitfalls of social striving as it dealt with the murder of a pregnant working girl by her socially ambitious young lover. Ernest Hemingway, who had seen action on the Italian front in 1917, was among the writers most affected by the war. He responded to pernicious propaganda and the overblown appeal to patriotism by devising his own lean, word-sparing but word-perfect style. Hemingway wrote on the iceberg principle. There are 7/8 of it underwater for every part that shows. His hard-boiled realism typified post-war writing. In The Sun Also Rises, he told of disillusioned, spiritually numb American expatriates in Europe. In A Farewell to Arms, he turned his own war story into one of the finest novels in any language about the war experience. Hemingway's literary successes and flamboyant personal life made him one of the most famous writers in the world. He won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1954 and blew out his brains with a shotgun blast in 1961. Hemingway, Fitzgerald, and many other American writers and painters formed an artistic lost generation as expatriates in post-war Europe. They found shelter and inspiration in the Paris salon of their brainy and eccentric countrywoman Gertrude Stein. A literary innovator in her own right, Stein had studied at Radcliffe College at Harvard University under famed philosopher William James. Her early works applied to the theory of stream of consciousness to literature. Hobnobbing in Paris with the iconoclastic artists Pablo Picasso and Henri Matisse, Stein wrote radically experimental poetry and prose, including Three Lives, Tender Buttons, and, most famously, the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas, named for her lifelong partner. Stein joined fellow American poets Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot in the vanguard of modernist literary innovation. These high modernists experimented with the breakdown of traditional literary forms and exposed the losses associated with modernity. They wrote in a self-consciously internationalist mode, haughtily rejecting the parochialism they found at home. Pound, a brilliantly erratic Idahoan who permanently deserted America for Europe, rejected what he called an old bitch civilization gone in the teeth, and proclaimed his doctrine, make it new. Pound strongly influenced the Missouri-born and Harvard-educated Eliot, who took up residence and eventual citizenship in England. The Waste Land, Eliot produced one of the most impenetrable but influential poems of the century. Composed of discontinuous segments, multiple perspectives, and arcane allusions, the poem depicts the fragmentation and frightening desolation of post-war society. Much more accessible was the poetry of fellow Harvard graduate E.E. Cummings, who relied on unorthodox diction and peculiar typesetting to produce startling poetical effects. Not all literary efforts of the era proved so radical. Many American writers continued to employ a familiar regionalist style that was by turns celebratory and critical. Robert Frost, a San Francisco-born poet, wrote hauntingly about the nature and folk ways of his adopted New England. Ever popular Carl Sandburg strolled the working class of Chicago in strong, simple cadences. Other regional writers caustically probed middle American small-town life. Sherwood Anderson dissected various fictional personalities in Winesburg, Ohio, finding them all in some ways warped by their cramped psychological surroundings. Sinclair Lewis, a hot-headed, heavy-drinking journalist from Sauk Centre, Minnesota, sprang into prominence in 1920 with Main Street, the best-selling story of one woman's unsuccessful revolt against provincialism. In Babbitt, he affectionately pilloried George F. Babbitt, a prosperous, vulgar, middle-class real estate broker who slavishly conforms to the respectable materialism of his group. The word Babbittry is quickly coined to describe his all-too-familiar lifestyle. William Faulkner, a dark-eyed, pensive Mississippian, focused on the displacement of the agrarian Old South by a rising industrial order. His life's work offered a fictional chronicle of an imaginary, history-rich, deep South county he named I cannot pronounce that. Yoknapatawpha. In powerful books like The Sound and the Fury and As I Lay Dying, Faulkner peeled back layers of time and consciousness from the constricted souls of his ingrown southern characters. In contrast to Hemingway's spare prose, Faulkner experimented with multiple narrators, complex structure, and stream of consciousness techniques. His extended mediation on the ragtag and bob ends of the old tales and talkings culminated in what some readers consider his greatest work, Absalom, Absalom. Though novelists and poets dominated modernist literary output in the 1920s, American composers and playwrights also made important contributions on the stage. Jerome Kern and Oscar Hammerstein's Showboat debuted on Broadway in 1927 as the first true American musical play. Eugene O'Neill, a restless Princeton dropout, emerged as America's first world-class playwright. In plays like Strange Interlude, O'Neill laid bare Freudian notions of sex and the subconscious in a succession of dramatic soliloquies. A prodigious playwright, he authored more than a dozen productions in the 1920s and garnered the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1936, 6 years after Sinclair Lewis had been named the first American winner. O'Neill rose from New York's Greenwich Village, which before and after the war was a seething cauldron of writers, painters, musicians, actors, and other worldly artists. After the war, a black culture renaissance also took root uptown in Harlem, led by such gifted writers as Claude McKay, Langston Hughes, and Zora Neale Hurston, and by jazz artists like Louis Armstrong and U.B. Blake. In an outpouring of creative expression called the Harlem Renaissance, they proudly exulted in their black culture and argued for a new Negro who is a full citizen and a social equal to whites. Adopting modernist techniques, Hughes and Hurston captured the oral and improvisational traditions of contemporary blacks in dialect-filled poetry and prose. Last one, okay. Wall Street's big bull market. Signals abounded that the economic joyride might end in a crash. Even in the best years of the 1920s, several hundred banks failed annually. This something-for-nothing craze was well illustrated by real estate speculation, especially the fantastic Florida boom that culminated in 1925. Numerous underwater lots were sold to eager purchasers for preposterous sums. The whole Wildcat scheme collapsed when the peninsula was devastated by a West Indian hurricane, which belied advertisements of a soothing tropical wind. The stock exchange provided even greater sensation. Speculation ran wild, and an orgy of boom or bust trading pushed the market up to dizzy peaks. Never sell American short, and be a bull on America were favorite catchwords, as Wall Street's bulls gored one another and fleeced greedy lambs. The stock market became a veritable gambling den. As the 1920s lurched forward, everybody seemed to be buying stocks on margin, that is, with a small down payment. Barbers, stenographers, and elevator operators cashed in on hot tips picked up while on duty. One valet was reported to have parlayed his wages into $250,000. The cash register crashed the social register. As rags to riches, Americans reverently worshipped at the altar of the ticker tape machine. So powerful was the intoxicant of quick profit that few heeded the warnings raised in certain quarters that this kind of physical prosperity could not last forever. Little was done by Washington to curb money-mad speculators. In the wartime days of Wilson, the national debt had rocketed from the 1914 figure of $1 million to the 1920 $1 billion to the 1921 peak of $23 billion. Conservative principles of money management pointed to a diversion of surplus funds to reduce his financial burden. A business-like move toward economic sanity was made in 1921 when Republican Congress created the Bureau of the Budget. The Bureau's director was to assist the president in preparing careful estimates of receipts and expenditures for submission to Congress as the annual budget. This new reform, long overdue, was designed in part to prevent haphazardly extravagant appropriations. The burdensome taxes inherited from the war were especially distasteful to the Secretary of the Treasury, Mellon, as well as to his fellow millionaires. Their theory was that such high levies forced the rich to invest in tax-exempt securities rather than in the factories that provided prosperous payrolls. The Mellonites also argued with considerable persuasiveness that high taxes not only discouraged business, but, in so doing, also brought a smaller net returning to the Treasury than moderate taxes. Seeking to secure the poor rich people, Mellon helped engineer a series of tax reductions from 1921 to 26. Congress followed his lead by repealing the excess profits tax, abolishing the gift tax, and reducing excise taxes, the surtax, the income tax, the income tax, and estate taxes. In 1921, a wealthy person with an income of $1 million had paid $663,000 in income taxes. In 1926, the same person had paid about $200,000. Secretary Mellon spared the rich policies, thus shifted much of the tax burden from the wealthy to the middle-income groups. Mellon, lionized by conservatives as the greatest Secretary of the Treasury since Hamilton, remains a controversial figure. True, he reduced the national debt by $10 billion from about $26 billion to $16 billion, but foes of the emancipated multimillionaire charged that he should have bitten an even larger chunk out of the debt, especially while the country was pulsating with prosperity. He was also accused of indirectly encouraging the bull market. If he had observed more of the national income and taxes, there would have been less money left for frenzied speculation. His refusal to do so typified the single-mindedly pro-business regime that dominated the political scene throughout the post-war decade. Okay, it's done. I was reading so bad. That's okay. Oh, yay.